The major kissing sequence was, well, my first kissing scene with N. Harrison. To get it right, several takes were required. Personally, I think I perform better just being myself, but I'll admit that anything I do ends up being kind of humorous. I'm not taken seriously by anyone. The fisherman believed he had retrieved a sack from a drifting net, but it was actually a woman who was still dressed, had her eyes gently closed, and had not been reported missing. January 14, 1985 was the date, near a small bay near Manzano, Mexico. The body of American television legend Carol Wayne, who had made the entire nation laugh on Johnny Carson's The Tonight Show, was discovered. She had no injuries, no drugs in her system, and no one understood why she was there by herself. She had argued with her companion and left the motel 3 days prior. That man never came back after taking her bags to the airport and boarding a plane to return to the United States. No search was conducted, no missing person report was filed, and nobody even mentioned her name. Carol Wayne disappeared as like she had never been there. And the scariest thing about it is that, how could a woman who personified America's smile and made more than 100 appearances on national television pass away in such silence? How could a humorous, seductive figure who was once the focus of attention be left behind like a mystery that no one wanted to solve? You'll travel through some of Hollywood's most sinister stretches. A murder that has never been fully explained, a skewed profession, a questioned role as a mother, and a stolen childhood. Carol Wayne's story will change your mind if you ever believed that unexplained deaths only occurred in movies. Carol Wayne was born in 1942 in Chicago, a frigid city where parents' strict expectations and deep snow frequently buried ambitions. At first, Carol didn't have any options. Her mother forced her into ballet school when she was just 3 years old. She and her younger sister, Nena, were taking figure skating lessons by the time she was 6 years old. The time of day was 5:00 a.m. Due to the demanding schedule and late-night training, she was unable to have a typical childhood. Carol bowed her body to the beat of the music and skated around the ice as though performing was her only purpose in life, while other children played and completed their homework. The fatigue, however, was not the most terrifying aspect. It was a controlled upbringing in which every dream belonged to someone else, and no one had ever asked her, "Do you want to do this?" Carol and Nina were enlisted in the Icecapades, a well-liked traveling ice show at the time, just as she was approaching puberty. The condition: quit school, go on the road, and start working as a professional performer right away. Only tour schedules, cosmetic kits, and countless hours on stage. No youth, no diploma. It was a chilling confession, as if she had realized too early that her life had no way back. Things seemed to brighten when she toured across America, but during one performance, Carol slipped on the ice, and a spectator's coin knocked her skate off course. Carol once said in a rare interview, "We were two beautiful girls with no education, nothing else to do." In addition to leaving a 5-inch scar on her knee, the fall permanently ended the dream of professional skating that she had clung to throughout her childhood, but never chose. After the wound healed, she had no education, no backup career, no stage left to return to, and no way forward. Carol and Nina were left in a void, caught between a forced past and an uncertain future. At that point, all they had were their appearance, a little performance talent, and an unidentified desire, so they decided on Las Vegas, which in the 1960s was not a place for girls looking for peace, but was ideal for those who needed to be noticed. Carol Wayne and her sister Nina didn't pick Las Vegas because they were desperate for attention, but rather because they had nowhere else to go. They were hired as showgirls at the Tropicana, a job that was glamorous on the outside but quiet on the inside. Carol's striking presence and bombshell figure attracted attention right away, but no one ever inquired about the long scar on her knee or the years of her childhood that had been taken from her. One day, at a party in Los Angeles, a man said to Carol, "We're looking for a girl like you." Like many other women who had heard similar ambiguous promises, she was skeptical. But she went to the audition the following morning, where she saw Carol Wayne for the first time stand in front of a camera, not to perform under someone else's direction, but to try to become someone else on her own terms. She quickly secured her first role, then another, and eventually started making appearances in popular television shows of the era, such as Bewitched, I Dream of Jeannie, and The Man from UNLE. In an interview, Carol joked, "I got all the roles the moment I got this chest." The audience laughed, but for Carol, it was a knowing smile in the face of tragedy. She understood that the roles were typically the same: blonde, sexy, a little ditzy, the kind of character Hollywood adored back then, and she didn't complain. In 1967, Carol got a call from NBC, and Johnny Carson wanted to try her out for a new comedy sketch on The Tonight Show. Her body was defining her, and every role she played was the same: pretty, charming, and never allowed to be smarter than the script. However, nobody anticipated that this very familiarity would propel her to stardom. No one could have predicted that a few minutes of weekly screen time in a comedy segment would make Carol Wayne one of the most adored faces in America for more than 10 years. But she stepped into the biggest role of her life just as the spotlight was starting to burn brightly. The sketch was titled Art Fern's Tea Time Movie, and she played the role of the Matinee Lady. Millions of Americans watched The Tonight Show every Friday night, from the late 1960s to the early 1980s, and every time Johnny Carson's character, Art Fern, took the stage, he was never by himself. Always by his side was a blonde woman in a short dress with a provocative bust line and wide, perplexed eyes that seemed to misunderstand everything. That was Carol Wayne, the Matinee woman. She had few lines, sometimes only a grin or an eyebrow lift, but every gesture she made became her signature. Her sweetness, charm, and comfort were what people loved about her, not the depth of her character. Her image was everywhere: magazines, postcards, wall calendars, the double entendres, the suggestive leans. Everything made the audience laugh and remember her. Carol became a familiar, pleasant, and straightforward part of the American rhythm. Success came quickly and flourished. Carol became a regular guest on game shows like Hollywood Squares, Celebrity Sweepstakes, and various comedy programs. Behind the scenes, however, Carol was aware of her predicament. "I studied acting," she once revealed. "I'm a book reader. Like everyone else, I went to the audition. However, no one was interested in my opinion. They only wanted to see my appearance." Her career, which seemed to be going well, was actually a one-way street. The more well-known she got, the more difficult it was to escape the perception that television had given her. Although the audience loved her and didn't want her to change, producers saw her as the ideal bimbo: beautiful, innocent, and never demanding depth. Rumors circulated that she had an intimate relationship with Johnny Carson, the most powerful TV host in America at the time, but they denied it. Carol smiled in a rare reaction to the media, saying, "He loved me, I loved him." No one wondered whether she was kidding or speaking the truth, but one thing was clear: Carson had a peculiar regard for her, and for almost a year after her passing, he quietly stopped using the Art Fern character as a tribute to her memory. We understood one other and he still sees me every night in his nightmares." The public continued to laugh at her appearances, but few realized that Carol was trying to change her fate. She auditioned for movies, took on more serious supporting roles, and declined overly suggestive offers. But Hollywood does not tolerate reinvention, and The Matinee Lady was one of the first segments cut when NBC decided to cut The Tonight Show from 90 minutes to 60. Carol Wayne once had it all: the audience's affection, the weekly glow of television lights on her face. But behind that smile was a personal life that had been shattered, torn apart, piece by piece. And with those few lost minutes of screen time, she slowly faded away from Hollywood. Fame can sometimes be a trap with no way out. She was married 3 times, all of which ended in heartbreak. And unlike her brief roles, true tragedy doesn't end gently. Her first marriage to Loretto "Larry" Sarah occurred during her ascent to fame, and they divorced after precisely 2 years. When questioned about it, Carol smiled bittersweetly. It was a sort of self-defense, funny on the outside, but inside was a woman learning to survive by pretending everything was fine. Her second husband, Barry Feinstein, was a famous photographer who had worked with Bob Dylan, George Harrison, and Janis Joplin. "Skating taught me to be flexible, but marriage really taught me how to bend." They had 1 son, Alex. Carol believed she had found a peaceful place in those early years with Feinstein. But Hollywood's lights never went out long enough for a woman like her to relax. She started to burn out juggling motherhood, filming, and keeping up a perfect, sexy image. Feinstein left when their son was still a little child. She married a 3rd time to television producer Burt Sugarman, who helped her keep a few small roles on game shows. But like the men before him, he left when her career lost its shine. Carol became a single mother, a role no audience ever saw and no camera ever captured. But it was the heaviest role she ever played. When Carol's Matinee Lady role was cut from The Tonight Show in 1980, the marriage ended, and within months she lost her job, her social status, the last man she had ever known, and the feeling that she still belonged to the industry she had once called home. That was when the real descent started, unstoppable, steady, and quiet. However, she was actually a middle-aged woman who was unemployed, in debt, and gradually losing her reputation. By 1984, she was under financial strain. Her assets had been depleted, most of them burned by her addiction and spending habits, and she declared that she had no money, no assets, no job, and no contracts pending. That same year, she made a desperate decision and posed nude for Playboy, not because she wanted to or to assert female empowerment, but because it was the only thing this industry had ever paid her well for: her body. The photos were bold and not in the classic Playboy style, but they didn't get the recognition she had hoped for. The petition that she filed with the court stated that she was worth $0, since she knew deep down that she would ultimately be viewed as a faded icon rather than a woman with depth, ambition, or inner worth. They did not help her career. Instead, they only made her heartbreak and despair worse. When she had nothing left to lose, she received an unusual offer. Richard Pryor, the comedy legend who was also struggling with addiction, offered to help her get clean. Carol Wayne accepted his promise to pay for her entire treatment and to give her a part in his next movie if she returned sober and sane. But like many promises in her life, it came too late. In early 1985, Carol Wayne left Los Angeles for a vacation in Mexico with no press, no filming schedule, and no plans for any future projects. She arrived at Losadas Resort, a renowned retreat in Manzano, with Edward Durston, a man in the entertainment industry known not for his talent, but for his shadowy associations. Some close to her believed that trip was a way for her to retreat, to rinse off the pain before starting over. People thought it was a vacation, a pause before a comeback. Durston was the last person to see Carol alive, and that detail over time became the biggest hole in the whole story. The two were scheduled to return to the United States on January 10th, but no one really knew the nature of their relationship, friends, lovers, or just someone Carol clung to during a vulnerable moment. However, they missed their flight for reasons that have never been explained, and since Las Aras was completely booked, they moved to a small, gloomy, and old hotel called Playa de Santiago, which was an unworthy place for someone who had once been a national star. Carol was incensed, and hotel staff remembered that when they got there, she refused to go inside, standing outside in silent rage, while Durston and a bellhop carried the luggage in. When Durst came back to find her a while later, she was gone. What he did next shocked everyone. Instead of calling the police, looking for her, or alerting anyone, Durston stayed at another hotel. The following morning, he left Mexico with Carol's luggage and told the airport employees, "She'll be coming later to claim it." Carol Wayne never showed up. She was still fully clothed, had no wounds, and had no alcohol or drugs in her system when her body was found floating face down in the shallow waters of Manzano Bay 3 days later, on January 13th. The forensic report estimated that she died 36 to 48 hours earlier, nearly immediately after she disappeared from the hotel. What happened? Some think she slipped and fell while walking along the shore, but the water was only a waist deep. Others think she committed suicide, but there was no note or evidence that she had planned for it. She had brought clothes, possessions, and a passport to Mexico in the hopes of starting over. Not the actions of someone who was prepared to end it all. Edward Durston, the man who not only abandoned her but also took her luggage after she vanished, came under suspicion. But the more disturbing fact was that this wasn't the first time he had been connected to a mysterious death. In 1969, TV host Art Linkletter's daughter, Diane Linkletter, died after falling from a window under mysterious circumstances. Edward Durston was the last person with her that day. Police declared it a suicide, and no charges were ever brought. The investigation into Carol Wayne never progressed, and although U.S. consular officials suspected foul play, Mexican authorities closed the case as accidental drowning. No witnesses, no evidence, and no one was ever held responsible. In the following year, Johnny Carson's Art Fern character, who had been teasing the Matinia lady for more than 10 years, disappeared from the airwaves, possibly as a form of acknowledgement. Thus, Carol Wayne, the woman who once made millions laugh, died in silence in the cold, with no one fighting for justice on her behalf. Some deaths are serious, and some people should never be allowed to go so quietly. Carol Wayne never received an Emmy. She has no museum wax figure, no star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and no documentary about her was produced for decades. But if you asked anyone who was alive in America in the 1970s, who was the Matinia lady, they would recall. After smiling, they would pause and inquire in a lower voice, "Did she die?" Not because she said anything profound, but because she was there, gentle, sexy, and comforting, like a cocktail after work or the laugh you needed to shake off a long, weary day. Carol Wayne was the most recognizable face of the week in an era when television was simpler. However, that was also her tragedy. When times changed, that archetype was left behind, and no one asked what Carol wanted to do, could do, or gave up to keep that smile on her face for 15 years. Instead, she was remembered for a role that was repeated endlessly, a character without voice, depth, or growth. She was the quintessential dumb blonde, a figure created to serve as the background for someone else's joke. At one point, she claimed, "I studied acting. I'm a book reader. Even though I attended serious auditions, Hollywood didn't notice. They just saw my chest." Her death, which was unexplained, unjust, and unheard, was the ultimate evidence of that cruel silence. It wasn't simply disappointment. It was a statement on a system that utilized women and then discarded them once they no longer suited the public's tastes. She was not a great actress, but she embodied a kind of woman, defined and then abandoned by Hollywood. And that made her more symbolic than any award could ever be. Nevertheless, she left behind a strange kind of legacy, a void no one has quite been able to fill. After Carol, many women graced the television screen, but few ever brought the same mix of humor, sensuality, and vulnerability. A certain older, quieter audience will remember that behind those stage lights stood a woman who reached the farthest edge of fame's loneliness, even though they still laugh at Carson's witty remarks and the Matina ladies' endearingly slow reactions when they rewatch the old Tonight Show sketches today. Since her body was discovered in Manzanillo Bay, there were no big headlines, no public funeral, and no farewells from the entertainment industry. This is why Carol Wayne, despite never being honored in the traditional ways, continues to live on in the collective memory as an icon of beauty, of eraser, and of the stories Hollywood never dares to finish telling. If Carol Wayne was merely a Matina lady, why is her death still discussed as an unsolved mystery over 40 years later? Maybe it's because she was never merely a beauty icon. One of the most adored faces on American television had quietly passed away, as if her years of service had been reduced to a commercial that had ended and been flipped past. She is a reminder that behind the spotlight, there are still people waiting, aching to be seen, not just by the public, but by life itself. Carol Wayne is not remembered through golden statues or vintage movie snippets. She was a living metaphor for women defined by appearance, wounded by indifference, and forgotten by an industry that only loves in the moment. What do you think of Carol Wayne's journey? Could it be that far too many people in the entertainment industry and in life have lived and vanished just like her, with no one searching, no one asking, and no one remembering the right way? If you ever admired Carol Wayne or felt sorrow for her, then her death and the silence that followed became the final performance that forces us to reflect on everything we once overlooked. She is remembered through empathy, through unanswered questions, and through the silence her conflicted presence left behind. What happened to her? Remember to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next heartwarming story we offer. And leave a comment stating Rippy Carol Wayne to show your love and remembrance.